The sun blazed over Miami's South Beach, its golden light shimmering on the waves as tourists and locals lounged beneath striped umbrellas. The air smelled of salt, sunscreen, and the faint aroma of grilled seafood from the nearby boardwalk. Elena Vasquez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she hurried across the sand, her paramedic bag bouncing against her hip. The emergency call had come in just minutes ago. A young girl had fallen near the volleyball courts and wasn't moving. Jolie Carter, her partner, jogged beside her, scanning the crowd for any sign of distress. There! Jolie pointed ahead, where a small crowd had gathered around a crying girl, no older than 10. Her mother knelt beside her, panic flashing in her eyes as she cradled her daughter's leg. "Paramedics coming through!" Eleanor called out, her voice firm yet calm. The crowd parted, revealing a pale-faced child clutching her ankle. A deep purple bruise had already begun to form. "She was playing and tripped over the net," the mother stammered. "She can't move her foot. Please help her." Elena knelt down, assessing the injury with practiced precision. "Okay, sweetheart. I need you to stay very still, all right? What's your name?" "Madison," the girl whimpered. "Well, Madison, you're in good hands. We're going to take care of you," Eleanor reassured, offering a soft smile before gently pressing around the swollen area. "Can you feel this?" Madison yelped, flinching at the slightest touch. A possible fracture, Elena noted. Jolie was already preparing the splint. "Breathe, sweetie," Elena murmured as she worked. "You're doing great." Just as they were stabilizing the injury, a sleek black Lamborghini pulled up near the emergency lane, its engine purring like a caged beast. Elena barely looked up. She was too focused on Madison, but the movement caught Jolie's attention. "Oh, look who's gracing us with his presence," Jolie muttered under her breath. Elena flicked her gaze toward the obnoxiously parked luxury car. A man, dressed in an open white linen shirt and expensive sunglasses, leaned against the door, phone pressed to his ear. Her stomach twisted in annoyance. She didn't need to hear his conversation to know the type. Rich, self-important, and completely oblivious to the world beyond his own. "David Kingston," Jolie confirmed, rolling her eyes. Of course, Miami's billionaire, socialite and media darling, a man whose name frequented business magazines and gossip columns alike. Elena ignored him, returning her focus to Madison. The girl's breathing had steadied, but her mother was still on the verge of tears. "You're both doing amazing," Elena assured them. "We're almost done." Behind her, David chuckled at something on his call, his voice smooth, rich, and utterly distracting. She gritted her teeth. Emergency vehicles were supposed to have priority access to this area. This wasn't a valet stand for spoiled billionaires. "Eleanor," Jolie warned in a low voice, sensing the storm brewing. But Elena was already standing. Her patience had limits, and this man had just found them. She strode toward him, her paramedic uniform and serious expression a stark contrast to his effortless, bored elegance. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clipped. "You're parked in an emergency zone." David lifted his sunglasses slightly, eyes the color of cool Atlantic waters meeting her heated gaze. "I won't be long," he said dismissively, returning to his phone. Wrong answer. "You need to move your car now," she snapped. "This area is for emergency responders only." David barely looked up this time. "If there's an emergency, I'll move it." Elena let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, the sheer arrogance, the unbelievable audacity. She took a slow, measured breath, then pulled out her radio. "Dispatch, we have a civilian vehicle illegally parked in a restricted emergency zone, requesting immediate tow assistance." David's head snapped up. "What the hell?" Elena gave him a tight, professional smile. "Towing services usually take 10 minutes, but if you hurry, you might beat them." Jolie stifled a laugh behind her. David removed his sunglasses completely now, looking at Elena as if seeing her for the first time. His jaw clenched. I don't think you know who I am, he said slowly. Elena folded her arms. I don't care. His lips parted slightly in disbelief, but before he could argue, sirens wailed in the distance. The tow truck had arrived. Elena turned her back on him, walking toward Jolie and Madison, who was now being gently lifted onto a stretcher. Behind her, David Kingston stood frozen, watching as his prized Lamborghini was hooked onto the tow truck. And for the first time in his privileged life, someone had completely ignored his wealth and status and put him in his place. David's jaw tightened as he watched his Lamborghini being hooked up to the tow truck. He had experienced many things in his life: hostile business takeovers, cutthroat negotiations, and public scrutiny. But never had someone dismissed him so easily. The sheer nerve of that woman. His fingers curled around his phone as he considered making a call to fix this, but something about her unwavering stance held him back. Eleanor, meanwhile, had already returned to Madison's side. The little girl was secured on the stretcher, her mother clinging to her hand, while Jolie reassured them about the trip to the hospital. Eleanor barely spared David another glance, her focus locked on the patient. That should have been the end of it. But as Madison was lifted into the ambulance, her mother suddenly turned toward David. "Excuse me, sir," she called, her voice hesitant. David, still brooding over his car situation, looked up. "Yes?" The woman hesitated before gesturing to her daughter. "She's scared. She loves those summer camps your foundation funds. Could you maybe say something to cheer her up?" Elena stiffened. She didn't need him swooping in, playing the hero after what just happened. But Madison's wide, teary eyes were watching him, and despite herself, Eleanor felt a twinge of curiosity. David sighed, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off his annoyance. Then he approached the stretcher, his expression shifting. "Madison, right?" he said, his voice taking on a smooth, reassuring tone. The little girl nodded hesitantly. "You know," he continued, "I broke my ankle when I was your age. Thought I'd never walk again. But guess what?" Madison sniffled. "What?" David smirked. "I did, and now I run a company where I boss around grown-ups all day. I bet you'll be back on your feet faster than I was." A small giggle escaped Madison, her mother visibly relaxing. Eleanor bit the inside of her cheek, refusing to acknowledge the unexpected warmth in her chest. David straightened, shooting Elena a sideways glance as if expecting some acknowledgement. She offered him nothing. Instead, she turned to Jolie. "Ready to roll?" Jolie nodded, hopping into the ambulance as Elena followed, shutting the door behind her. The siren blared to life, and in moments they were pulling away, leaving David standing on the curb, his car disappearing down the street on the back of the tow truck. For the first time in years, he wasn't the most powerful man in the room, or the street, for that matter. And he didn't like it one bit. Later that evening, Elena returned home, tossing her paramedic bag onto the couch as the smell of warm chocolate filled the air. Anna was in the kitchen, humming to herself while icing freshly baked cupcakes. "Rough day?" she asked without looking up. Eleanor exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "More like frustrating." Anna finally glanced at her, taking in the tension in her shoulders. "Patient trouble or annoying billionaire trouble?" Elena scoffed. "Both, but mostly the second one." Anna grinned. "Tell me everything." As Elena recounted the ridiculous encounter, Anna listened with an amused smirk, only interrupting to grab 2 plates and hand Elena a cupcake. "So, let me get this straight. You called a tow truck on David Kingston." Elena nodded as she bit into the cupcake. "Yep." Anna burst into laughter. "That man probably owns half the city, and you just, poof, got rid of his car?" "Illegally parked is illegally parked," Elena said matter-of-factly. Anna leaned against the counter, shaking her head in disbelief. "I give him a week before he tries to track you down," Eleanor scoffed. I doubt he cares that much. But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the image of the way he had looked at her, like no one had ever dared challenge him before. What she didn't know was that, at that very moment, David Kingston was sitting in his high-rise penthouse, scrolling through his phone. A small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips as he replayed their conversation in his head. Elena Vasquez, he murmured to himself. Oh, he'd be seeing her again. The next morning, Elena was already deep into her shift when she received a new home care assignment. She barely glanced at the name on the chart as she strapped her medical bag over her shoulder and climbed into the ambulance with Jolie. "Where to?" Jolie asked, steering onto the main road. Eleanor flipped through the file, then nearly choked on her coffee when she read the address. "No way." Jolie glanced over. "What?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "We're going to Kingston Estate." Jolie whistled low. So, from having his car towed to now treating his family, fate really loves messing with you. Elena exhaled sharply, already regretting this shift. She could handle difficult patients, chaotic ER nights, and even stubborn paramedics. But David Kingston? That was a level of frustration she wasn't prepared for before her second cup of coffee. When they pulled into the massive circular driveway, the sight of the Kingston mansion nearly stole Elena's breath. The estate was sprawling, the kind of home that only existed in architectural magazines or Hollywood films. Ivory columns framed the entrance, and the perfectly manicured gardens stretched endlessly toward a private golf course in the back. A sleek sports car was parked beside the fountain. Not his Lamborghini, but something equally expensive. The door swung open before they even knocked, and an older woman in a crisp uniform stood there, her warm smile a stark contrast to the grandeur around her. "You must be Elena and Jolie. I'm Maria Sanchez, Mr. Kingston's housekeeper. Please, come in. Mr. Kingston is upstairs." Maria led them through a high-ceilinged hallway filled with modern art and glass chandeliers, the kind of wealth that was displayed effortlessly. Elena kept her expression neutral, refusing to let the extravagance faze her. But when they reached the master bedroom, she stiffened at the sight of David leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, wearing that same unreadable smirk. "What a coincidence," he drawled, his voice dripping with amusement. Eleanor refused to take the bait, pushing past him into the room where Richard Kingston was resting in a recliner near the windows. His skin looked paler than the last time she'd seen him, but his eyes still held the sharpness of a man who had built an empire. "Mr. Kingston," she greeted professionally, kneeling beside him. "How are you feeling today?" Richard gave a tired but knowing smile. "Better now that my son has stopped pacing like a worried mother. Though, I must say, you've certainly made an impression on him." Eleanor flicked a glance at David, who raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Ignoring the weight of his gaze, she focused on Richard's vitals, checking his blood pressure and oxygen levels. "You had another dizzy spell?" she asked, noting the numbers. Richard nodded. "Maria caught me before I could make a fool of myself." Maria, standing by the window, huffed. "You did make a fool of yourself, sir. You nearly toppled an entire bookshelf." Richard chuckled. "She exaggerates." Eleanor, suppressing a grin, continued her assessment. "Your vitals are stable, but the dizziness is concerning. Are you keeping up with your medications?" Before Richard could answer, David spoke up from behind her. "He's been skipping doses." Richard shot his son a glare. "Don't you have a meeting to attend instead of meddling?" David ignored him, addressing Eleanor instead. "He thinks no one notices when he forgets his pills. But Maria and I have been keeping track." Elena sighed, tapping the medical chart. "Skipping doses could cause sudden drops in blood pressure, which explains the dizziness." She looked Richard squarely in the eyes. "You need to take this seriously, sir." Richard held up his hands in surrender. All right. No need to gang up on an old man." Eleanor packed up her equipment, making notes for Dr. Olivia's review. As she moved toward the door, Richard called out, "Eleanor, before you go, tell me, what's your opinion of my son?" The question caught her off guard. She turned, catching David watching her with a faint smirk. She hesitated before answering. "He's persistent," she said carefully. Richard laughed, while David's smirk widened. "That's one way to put it." Jolie cleared her throat, suppressing laughter as they exited the room. As soon as they were out of earshot, she nudged Eleanor. "Persistent, huh? That's the word you're going with?" Eleanor rolled her eyes. "Drop it." But as they walked through the Kingston mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time she'd be seeing David Kingston. Maria walked them to the front entrance, her presence warm despite the intimidating surroundings. "He likes you," she said suddenly, her voice low but knowing. Eleanor turned to her, brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" Maria gave a small smile. "Mr. Kingston, the younger one, he wouldn't have stayed in the room if he wasn't interested." Eleanor let out a dry laugh. "I'm pretty sure he stayed just to irritate me." Maria tilted her head slightly, studying her as if debating whether to say more, then simply nodded. "Perhaps. But I've known that boy since he was born. He doesn't let many people challenge him." Jolie nudged Elena playfully once they were outside. "So the billionaire likes a woman who tells him off. Interesting." Elena groaned. "Drop it, Jolie." But as they climbed into the ambulance, she found herself replaying Maria's words, brushing them off yet unable to fully dismiss them. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, David watched from the upstairs window as the ambulance pulled away. Maria entered behind him, carrying a tray of untouched tea. "You should be nicer to her," Maria said, placing the tray down. David smirked, though his eyes didn't leave the driveway. "Where's the fun in that?" Maria sighed, shaking her head. "I mean it, David. She's not like the women you're used to." He turned to face her, amusement flickering in his expression. "I'm well aware." That evening, Elena sat at the small dining table in her apartment, absent-mindedly twirling a pen between her fingers. Anna sat across from her, flipping through her phone, only half paying attention. "So, you spent the afternoon in the mansion of the man whose car you got towed. That's normal." Elena sighed. "It was just work." Anna raised an eyebrow. "And his dad randomly asked what you thought of him?" Eleanor hesitated. "Yeah, which was weird." Anna grinned. "And what did you say?" Eleanor groaned, covering her face with her hands. "I said he was persistent." Anna burst out laughing. "Oh my God, that's basically an invitation." Elena threw a napkin at her. "Shut up." Anna continued laughing, but then her phone vibrated and her expression shifted. Elena noticed the sudden tension in her friend's face. "Anna?" Anna forced a smile, placing the phone screen down on the table. "Nothing. Just Lucas saying he's working late again." Elena frowned. "That's the third time this week." Anna shrugged, but her voice lacked confidence. "He's just busy." Elena wasn't convinced, but she didn't push. Across the city, David sat in his penthouse, scrolling through emails on his tablet, but his thoughts kept straying. Elena Vasquez. He had met countless women, ones who admired him, feared him, used him. But she was different. She didn't care about his money, his name, or his reputation. She had looked him in the eye and told him exactly what she thought. No hesitation, no deference. It was irritating and intriguing. His phone buzzed. Lisa. He stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "David," she purred, her voice smooth, calculated. "The Kingston Foundation Gala is next weekend. I assume you'll be attending?" He leaned back in his chair. "Haven't decided yet." Lisa laughed softly. "Come on, you wouldn't miss the most exclusive event in Miami. Besides, I have a feeling it'll be..." interesting this year. David narrowed his eyes slightly. Lisa always played games, but tonight, something about her tone made him uneasy. "What are you up to?" he asked. She chuckled. "Now, where's the fun in telling you?" Before he could respond, she ended the call, leaving him staring at his phone, thoughts shifting back to a certain headstrong paramedic who had managed to throw his world slightly off balance, and he wasn't sure if he hated it or wanted more. The following evening, Elena was finishing her shift at the hospital when Dr. Olivia Hayes stopped her in the hallway. "Elena, can I have a moment?" Elena adjusted the strap of her bag, nodding as she followed her mentor into her office. Dr. Hayes motioned for her to sit, folding her hands on the desk. "I wanted to personally inform you that Miami Medical School has officially moved you up from the wait list." Elena's breath caught in her throat. "Wait, what? Are you saying I got in?" Dr. Hayes smiled. "You did. Congratulations." Elena blinked, her heart pounding. She had spent years dreaming of this, sacrificing, working endless shifts, studying whenever she had a spare moment. And now, it was real. Dr. Hayes's smile softened. "I know this is a lot to process, but I also wanted to mention that part of your tuition has already been covered by a private donor." Eleanor's excitement dimmed. "A donor?" Dr. Hayes nodded. "Yes, an anonymous contribution was made specifically for you." Eleanor sat back in her chair, her stomach twisting. There weren't many people in her life who could afford such generosity, and the moment the thought crossed her mind, she knew exactly who she suspected. David Kingston. Dr. Hayes continued, oblivious to Elena's brewing frustration. "You deserve this opportunity, Elena, and I have no doubt you'll make an incredible doctor." Elena forced a tight smile, thanked Dr. Hayes, and left the office. But inside, anger simmered beneath her skin. If David thought he could just throw money at her future like it was some kind of game, he was sorely mistaken. She barely made it out of the hospital before pulling out her phone. Her fingers hovered over his name. She still had his contact from his father's medical file. Taking a sharp breath, she pressed call. It rang twice before he picked up. "Vasquez." David's voice was smooth, amused. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Elena didn't waste time. "Did you pay for my tuition?" A brief pause. Then, "Excuse me? You heard me?" she snapped. "Did you donate money to Miami Med with my name attached to it?" David let out a slow breath, and she could practically hear the smirk in his voice when he replied, "Is this how you thank people for their generosity?" Her blood boiled. "So it was you?" Another pause. "I never said that." "That's not a denial." "Eleanor," he said, voice maddeningly calm, "even if I did, hypothetically, contribute to a school I've supported for years, why would that be a problem?" "Because I don't need your charity." David laughed under his breath. "And yet you need med school." She clenched her jaw. "I worked for this. I earned my place. I won't have you throwing money around like I'm some cause you need to fix." There was a beat of silence. Then his voice shifted, lower, quieter. "You really think that's what this is?" Elena hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden change in his tone. She had been so sure of his arrogance, his meddling, but something about the way he said it almost sounded personal. Before she could respond, David sighed. "Meet me at the Kingston Foundation Gala this weekend." She blinked. "What? You want to talk about this? Fine, but do it in person." "I'm not going to some billionaire gala." "You should," he interrupted smoothly. "You might be surprised by what you learn." Before she could argue, the call ended. Elena stared at her phone, heart racing, fury and curiosity warring in her chest. Damn him. She hated how he always had the last word. Elena lowered her phone, her fingers tightening around it. She was furious. but more than that, she was unsettled. David Kingston was a lot of things: arrogant, infuriating, and too damn charming for his own good. But was he really the type to throw money at her future just to get under her skin? Or was there something more? Back at her apartment, Anna noticed the tension the moment Elena walked through the door. "Okay, what happened?" she asked, setting down a bowl of popcorn. Eleanor dropped onto the couch, rubbing her temples. "I got into med school." Anna's eyes widened. "Eleanor, that's amazing. Why do you look like you want to murder someone?" Eleanor exhaled sharply. "Because someone anonymously donated money toward my tuition." Anna's excitement faltered. "And let me guess, you think it was Kingston?" Eleanor nodded. Anna's expression shifted, thoughtful now. "And what if it was?" Elena frowned. "What?" Anna shrugged. "I mean, think about it. Would it really be the worst thing? You've worked your ass off for this. If someone's willing to help—" "I don't want his help," Elena snapped, standing abruptly. "I don't want to owe him anything." Anna watched her carefully. "Are you sure this is about the money, or is it about him?" Elena opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Was it about him? Before she could respond, Anna smirked. "And let me guess, he invited you to the gala?" Elena groaned. "How did you know?" Anna tossed a piece of popcorn into her mouth. "Rich guys always have a gala. It's like a rule." Eleanor shook her head. "I'm not going." "You should." Eleanor shot her a look. "Seriously?" Anna grinned. 1, you need answers. 2, you've never been to a gala before, and you should at least experience one before you spend the rest of your life in scrubs. Elena scoffed but didn't immediately shut it down. Anna leaned forward. "And 3, don't you want to see his face when you show up looking like a goddamn queen?" Elena rolled her eyes, but she couldn't ignore the slight thrill that ran through her at the thought. Meanwhile, across the city, David sat in his office, swirling a glass of whiskey between his fingers. His father had always told him that power wasn't just about wealth, but about control, knowing when to push and when to step back. He had spent years perfecting that balance. But with Elena Vasquez, every carefully laid-out rule seemed to crumble. She wasn't predictable. She wasn't impressed by his name or his money. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't entirely sure what would happen next. He smirked to himself, placing the glass down as he leaned back in his chair. If she came to the gala, it wouldn't just be about proving a point. It would be about seeing what happened when a woman like Elena Vasquez walked into his world and refused to play by its rules. Elena stood in front of the full-length mirror, her fingers smoothing down the fabric of the deep emerald dress Anna had practically forced her to wear. The gown hugged her curves in all the right places, the silky material cascading down to the floor in effortless elegance. She felt strange, almost like she had stepped into someone else's life. This wasn't her world. Glamorous galas, expensive gowns, and champagne toasts, but for one night she would walk through it on her own terms. "Damn!" Anna whistled from the doorway, arms crossed. "You look like you belong on a magazine cover." Elena rolled her eyes, but couldn't help the small smile tugging at her lips. "You really think this is necessary?" Anna smirked. 100%. Besides, you need answers, and something tells me Kingston isn't the type to explain himself over text. That much was true. David had been frustratingly vague over the phone, leaving her no choice but to meet him in person if she wanted to set the record straight. A black car arrived promptly at 8, sent by the Kingston Foundation. Elena hesitated before stepping inside, exhaling slowly as the driver pulled away from her modest apartment complex, steering toward a world far removed from her own. The moment she arrived at the grand Kingston estate, she realized just how different their worlds were. The mansion was even more breathtaking at night, illuminated by golden lights that stretched across the vast property. Valets ushered guests inside as luxury cars lined the circular driveway. Elena straightened her shoulders, refusing to let herself feel out of place. She wasn't here to blend in. She was here for answers. As she stepped through the grand entrance, the sheer opulence of the event hit her. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, casting a warm glow over the sea of elegantly dressed guests mingling with practiced ease. Waiters in pristine uniforms floated through the crowd, offering flutes of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly in the background, completing the picture of effortless wealth. And then she saw him. David Kingston stood near the grand staircase, exuding an effortless dominance that drew attention whether he wanted it or not. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, the crisp white shirt beneath it unbuttoned just enough to hint at casual confidence. A glass of whiskey rested in his hand, but his gaze was locked onto her the second she stepped inside. Elena felt the weight of his stare as he took her in, his usual smirk giving way to something more unreadable. She lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. David handed his glass to a passing waiter and strode toward her, his steps slow, measured, as if savoring the moment. "You came," he said, his voice smooth as ever. Elena crossed her arms. "I want answers." David's lips twitched. "And here I thought you came just to see me." She exhaled sharply, already regretting this. "David." He held up a hand in mock surrender. "All right, let's talk, but not here." Before she could protest, he placed a gentle but firm hand on the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd toward a secluded balcony overlooking the estate's sprawling gardens. The cool night air greeted them as he leaned casually against the railing, watching her with unreadable eyes. "So," he said, tilting his head, "you think I paid your tuition?" Elena folded her arms. "Didn't you?" David let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You really think I'd do that without telling you?" Elena hesitated. "I don't know what you would do, David. That's the problem." He studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. "I didn't pay your tuition, Elena, but I did donate to Miami Med, like I have for years. If some of that money ended up helping you, that wasn't my call." Eleanor opened her mouth to argue but hesitated. He looked sincere, and that frustrated her even more. Then who did? David exhaled, his gaze flickering past her for a brief second. "I have a few guesses." Before he could elaborate, a smooth, sultry voice interrupted. "Well, well, if it isn't our unexpected guest." Elena turned just as Lisa Monroe stepped onto the balcony, dressed in an impossibly sleek crimson gown, her sharp gaze assessing Elena from head to toe. A slow smile spread across Lisa's lips. "I was wondering why David looked so distracted tonight." Elena kept her expression neutral, refusing to let Lisa's condescending tone get to her. David, however, sighed, looking mildly annoyed. "Lisa, now's not the time." Lisa ignored him, her eyes glinting with amusement as she circled Eleanor like a shark. "I have to say, you clean up well. But then again, I suppose even the most unexpected guests can be entertaining, if only for a night." Eleanor met her gaze, unshaken. "Don't worry, I have no intention of overstaying my welcome." Lisa smirked. "Good, because this world, it's not for people like you." David's jaw tightened. "Lisa." Lisa placed a manicured hand on his chest, ignoring the warning in his voice. "Come on, David, let's not pretend. She's different, sure, but at the end of the day, we both know how this ends. She walks away, and you go back to where you belong." Eleanor felt something twist in her chest, but she forced herself to stay composed. Lisa's words weren't entirely untrue. She and David were from two different worlds. But that didn't mean she would let this woman dictate her choices. Before David could say anything, Eleanor took a step forward, her voice calm but firm. You seem awfully invested in my presence here, Lisa. It almost sounds like insecurity. Lisa's confident mask flickered for a fraction of a second before she recovered, letting out a small, amused laugh. How cute! David stepped between them, his tone clipped. Enough. His gaze shifted to Elena. Come with me. Elena hesitated only for a moment before following him back inside, leaving Lisa standing alone on the balcony, her expression darkening. As they walked through the crowd, Elena exhaled, shaking her head. Your ex is delightful. David let out a humorless chuckle. She thrives on control. You caught her off guard. Good, Elena muttered. David glanced down at her, something unreadable flickering in his expression. You didn't let her get to you. Eleanor met his gaze. I've dealt with worse. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt charged, something unspoken lingering just beneath the surface. Then, before the moment could stretch too far, David smirked. You're full of surprises, Vasquez. Eleanor rolled her eyes. And you're still avoiding my question. If you didn't pay my tuition, then who did? David's smirk faded slightly. I have my suspicions. But if I'm right, you're not going to like the answer. Elena narrowed her eyes. Try me. David exhaled. I think my father had something to do with it. Elena froze. Richard? David nodded. He's always taken an interest in people who don't take shortcuts. And you, Eleanor? You're as far from a shortcut as it gets. Eleanor's mind raced. She had barely spoken to Richard Kingston beyond medical visits. Why would he do this? David watched her carefully. If you want answers, I suggest you ask him yourself. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her heart pounding. This night had taken a turn she hadn't expected, and something told her it was only the beginning. Eleanor gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary as she pulled into the long, winding driveway of the Kingston estate. The towering gates opened smoothly as the security system recognized her car, and she drove forward, her thoughts racing. The last thing she expected after the gala was to find out that Richard Kingston might have been the one responsible for her tuition assistance. It didn't make sense. She had treated him as she would any other patient. Professional, direct, no special treatment. So why would a billionaire care enough to quietly fund her education? She parked near the front entrance, stepping out and adjusting her coat against the morning breeze. As she approached the massive doors, Maria greeted her with a warm, knowing smile. He's expecting you. Eleanor nodded, following Maria through the familiar grand hallways until they reached Richard's study. The older man was seated in a leather chair by the window, a book resting open in his lap. He looked up as they entered, a slow smile forming. Ah, Nurse Vasquez. Or should I say, future doctor Vasquez. Eleanor inhaled sharply, stepping forward. So it was you. Richard chuckled, setting his book aside. Straight to the point. I like that about you. She crossed her arms. Why? Richard studied her for a long moment before gesturing for her to sit. She hesitated, then took a seat across from him. I have seen many people walk through these doors, Elena, he began. Some seeking help, some looking for favors, most with a price tag attached to their loyalty. But you are different. Elena frowned. That's not an answer. He smirked, amused by her persistence. I did it because I believe in people who work hard. You didn't ask for help. You didn't try to win favor with me or my son. You simply did your job. That kind of integrity is rare. Elena clenched her hands in her lap. I appreciate the gesture, but I can't accept it. I don't want to owe anyone. Richard sighed, leaning back. Then don't. Consider it an investment in the future of medicine. The world needs good doctors. She exhaled slowly, unsure how to argue with that. Before she could respond, a voice cut in from the doorway. She doesn't like gifts, Dad. Elena turned to see David leaning casually against the doorframe, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. She prefers towing cars instead. Richard chuckled. Ah, yes, I heard about that. Elena rolled her eyes. It was a justified tow. David smirked. I'm sure it was. Richard watched their exchange with interest. I see my son has finally met someone who doesn't worship the ground he walks on. Eleanor shook her head, standing. I didn't come here for an argument. I just needed to understand why you did it. Richard gave her a small smile. And now you do. She nodded, turning toward the door. But as she stepped past David, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You're going to have to get used to people helping you, Vasquez. She met his gaze, her voice just as quiet. And you're going to have to get used to the fact that I don't need saving. David's smirk didn't fade, but there was something else in his eyes this time. Something unreadable. Something dangerously intriguing. As Elena walked out of the Kingston estate, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Elena barely made it back to her car before her phone buzzed. She sighed, expecting Anna, but instead David's name flashed across the screen. She debated ignoring it, but curiosity won out. What now, Kingston? She answered, leaning against her car. David's voice was smooth, laced with amusement. I was going to let you leave in peace, but I just had to ask, are you always this stubborn, or do I bring out something special in you? Elena exhaled sharply. If you called just to hear yourself talk, I have better things to do. David chuckled. Relax, Vasquez. I was actually calling to invite you to dinner. She blinked, caught off guard. Why? Because we seem to have an ongoing situation, he said, his tone almost teasing. And since you refuse to owe anyone anything, consider this a truce. One meal, no arguments, just food and conversation. Elena hesitated. Every instinct told her not to get tangled up in David Kingston's world any more than she already had. But the way he said it, as if daring her, made her pause. Fine, she relented. But if you start talking about private jets and overpriced whiskey, I'm leaving. David laughed. Noted. I'll pick you up at 8. She ended the call, shaking her head. What the hell was she getting herself into? That evening, Anna watched as Eleanor debated between two dresses, her usual confidence faltering. I don't know why you're stressing, Anna mused, sipping her wine. It's just dinner. Eleanor shot her a glare. It's not a date, Anna smirked. Sure, and I'm not enjoying watching you panic. Eleanor groaned, pulling on the simpler of the two dresses, a sleek black number that wasn't too formal but still elegant enough for whatever restaurant David had in mind. By the time 8 rolled around, a sleek black car pulled up outside her apartment. Elena inhaled, steeling herself before stepping out. David leaned against the car door, his gaze sweeping over her with an unreadable expression. You clean up well, Vasquez. She rolled her eyes. Try not to sound so surprised. He grinned, opening the door for her. As she slid into the car, she told herself this was just a meal, nothing more. But deep down, she knew better. Nothing with David Kingston was ever just simple. The restaurant was the kind Elena had only seen in magazines. Dim lighting, soft jazz humming in the background, and waiters dressed in sharp, tailored suits, moving with effortless precision. The moment she stepped inside, she felt the weight of the exclusivity, but she refused to let it faze her. If David Kingston wanted to impress her with luxury, he was in for disappointment. David led her to a private booth in the back, where the hum of conversation was low and the atmosphere carried an air of intimacy she wasn't entirely comfortable with. He slid into the seat across from her, watching with that ever-present smirk as she examined the menu. You can relax, Vasquez, he mused, picking up his whiskey. I'm not trying to trap you in some billionaire lair. It's just dinner. Elena lifted a brow. Then why do I feel like I walked into a business negotiation? David chuckled, setting his glass down. Because you're suspicious by nature. It's part of your charm. Elena ignored the warmth creeping up her neck and focused on the menu. Everything was overpriced, and half of it was in French. David caught her expression. Go ahead, say it. She sighed. This place is ridiculous. He grinned. Noted. A waiter appeared, taking their orders with perfect composure. Elena settled on a dish she could pronounce, while David ordered effortlessly, as if he had dined here 1,000 times. Once they were alone again, Eleanor leaned forward slightly. Let's get to the point. Why did you invite me here? David studied her for a moment before answering. Because I want to understand you. She blinked, caught off guard. Understand me? He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. You don't fit the mold, Elena. You challenge people. You don't take handouts. You don't bend. And you sure as hell don't let people like me dictate anything to you. He tilted his head. So tell me, why? Elena folded her arms. Maybe because I grew up in a world where people didn't get things handed to them. And when they did, there was always a price. David nodded slowly. Fair enough. She narrowed her eyes. And what about you, Kingston? Why do you throw money at problems instead of facing them? He chuckled, but there was something darker in his gaze now. Because money has never failed me. People have. The way he said it, so casually yet weighted with meaning, made something shift in her chest. She had expected arrogance, maybe even a smooth deflection. But this was real. Before she could respond, the waiter arrived with their food, the moment breaking. But as she picked up her fork, she realized something unsettling. She wasn't just learning about David Kingston. She was starting to understand him, and that was dangerous. Elena took a slow bite of her food, using the moment to steady herself. She hadn't expected this dinner to turn into something resembling honesty, and she definitely hadn't expected to see something vulnerable lurking beneath David Kingston's usual smirk. It threw her off balance. David, on the other hand, looked entirely at ease as he cut into his steak, watching her with quiet amusement. So, tell me something, Vasquez, he said after a moment. Why did you become a nurse? Elena glanced up, surprised by the question. Why do you care? His smirk didn't fade. I like knowing what motivates people. She considered brushing him off, but decided against it. Because someone once told me that if you're in a position to help, you should. My mum was a nurse. I watched her work double shifts, take care of patients who had no one, and still come home and make sure I had everything I needed. Her voice softened. She made a difference. I wanted to do the same. David was quiet for a beat. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its usual sharp edge. She sounds like someone worth looking up to. Eleanor nodded, swallowing the sudden lump in her throat. She was. David set his fork down, fingers tapping lightly against the table. And your father. Her expression hardened. Not in the picture. David didn't push, and for that she was grateful. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt strangely natural. Then, just as Elena was beginning to process the unexpected shift in their dynamic, Lisa Monroe walked through the restaurant doors. Elena didn't react, but she noticed the subtle way David's jaw tensed. Lisa hadn't seen them yet, but it was only a matter of time. David sighed, picking up his whiskey. Well, this should be fun. Elena arched a brow. She doesn't seem like the kind of ex who moves on gracefully. David smirked, but there was no real humor in it. Lisa doesn't believe in losing. And as Lisa's gaze finally landed on them, her lips curving into a slow, deliberate smile, Elena had a feeling she was about to find out exactly what that meant. Lisa approached their table with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Her red dress clung to her like a second skin, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor with each deliberate step. Elena didn't move, didn't react, but she felt the shift in energy the moment Lisa reached them. "David," Lisa purred, her manicured fingers grazing the edge of the table as she cast a slow glance at Elena. "I didn't realize you had company." David leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "Lisa." Lisa's smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened. "What a coincidence, running into you here. Though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. This is your kind of place." Her gaze flickered to Elena, assessing. "But I can't say I expected this." Elena remained impassive, refusing to let Lisa's presence rattle her. "I guess you'll have to start expecting the unexpected." Lisa's smirk tightened just slightly before she turned her attention back to David. "You never mentioned you were expanding your social circles." David exhaled, setting his glass down with a quiet clink. "Lisa, do you need something, or are you just here to make conversation?" Lisa tilted her head, pretending to think. "I was just curious. After all, I thought we were going to talk at the gala, but you disappeared before we had the chance." Eleanor didn't miss the implication. Lisa was here to remind David that she still had access to him, still had unfinished business. David, however, looked utterly bored. "I didn't realize I owed you a conversation." Lisa's lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to be so dismissive, but then she recovered quickly. "No, I suppose you don't." She straightened, offering Elena a slow, deliberate smile. "It was lovely meeting you, Elena." Elena smiled back, just as sharp. "Likewise." Lisa hesitated for only a second before turning on her heel and walking away. David watched her go, his expression unreadable. Elena picked up her glass of water, taking a slow sip before saying, "She's charming." David smirked. "Lisa doesn't play fair. Never has." Elena leaned forward slightly. "And yet, you used to be with her." His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. "A long time ago." She studied him, the weight of unspoken things filling the space between them. Whatever history David and Lisa shared, it was complicated. Before she could ask more, David's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then frowned. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. David exhaled. "It's about my father." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "Is he okay?" David stood, already reaching for his jacket. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." Without thinking, Elena grabbed her coat. "I'm coming with you." David's gaze met hers, something unreadable flickering in his expression. He didn't argue, and as they hurried out of the restaurant, Eleanor had the sinking feeling that whatever came next was going to change everything. The drive to Kingston Estate was tense, the low hum of the car's engine the only sound between them. David's grip on the wheel was tight, his jaw clenched as he navigated the darkened roads at a controlled but urgent speed. Elena sat beside him, her own thoughts racing. Richard had seemed stable the last time she saw him, but things could change quickly, especially with a man of his age and condition. When they pulled up to the estate, Maria was already waiting at the entrance, her expression tight with worry. "He collapsed about 15 minutes ago," she said as they stepped inside. "I found him in the study, unconscious. He came to before I called, but he's weak." David didn't wait for more information, striding past her toward the grand staircase. Eleanor followed, slipping seamlessly back into medical mode. As they entered the study, she spotted Richard sitting in his recliner, looking pale but alert. He offered a small smirk. "Well, this is embarrassing." David's expression was anything but amused. What the hell happened? Richard sighed. Nothing dramatic, just stood up too fast. Elena moved toward him, already checking his pulse, his breathing, watching for any signs of distress. Did you feel lightheaded before you collapsed? Richard hesitated, then nodded. A little. It passed. She pressed her lips together, checking his blood pressure. It was low, lower than it should be. She glanced at Maria. Has he been eating normally? Maria shook her head. Not really. He's been skipping meals. David's frustration boiled over. Dad, are you trying to kill yourself? Richard sighed, clearly exhausted. David. No, David cut him off. This isn't just about you being stubborn. You're ignoring your health and it's going to catch up to you. Elena touched his arm, voice calm but firm. His blood pressure is too low. He needs fluids and rest, but if this happens again, he needs to go to the hospital. Richard exhaled, giving her a knowing look. You're not going to let me off easy, are you? She shook her head. Not a chance. David ran a hand through his hair, still visibly frustrated, but when he spoke again, his voice was softer. You have people who care about you. Stop making it harder for them. Richard studied his son for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then, finally, he nodded. All right. No more skipping meals. Maria sighed in relief, and Elena let out a slow breath. But as she met David's gaze across the room, she could see it. This wasn't just about Richard. David wasn't used to feeling helpless, and tonight had reminded him just how fragile everything could be. The house was quieter than usual when Elena arrived at the Kingston estate the next morning. Maria greeted her at the door, looking relieved to see her. He's in the study, Maria said softly. He won't admit it, but he's still weak. Eleanor nodded, making her way down the familiar hallway. When she stepped inside, Richard was sitting by the window, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. He looked better than the night before, but there was still a paleness to his complexion, a weariness in the way he held himself. You don't have to check on me every day, you know, he said as she approached. Eleanor crossed her arms. Considering you collapsed less than 24 hours ago, I absolutely do. Richard chuckled, setting his coffee down. I suppose there's no arguing with you. She gave him a pointed look. Smart man. Before she could begin her assessment, the study door opened and David stepped inside. He was dressed more casually than usual. No suit, just dark slacks and a crisp button-down with the sleeves rolled up. His gaze flickered between her and his father before he leaned against the desk. Should I be concerned that you see my father more than I do? David mused, his smirk faint but present. Elena didn't miss a beat. Maybe if you checked on him more often, I wouldn't have to. Richard let out a low laugh, but David only shook his head. Touché. She turned back to Richard, ignoring the way David's presence shifted the air in the room. You need to be more careful. Your blood pressure was dangerously low last night, and skipping meals isn't helping. Richard sighed but nodded. Maria already gave me the lecture. She should, Elena said, because if this happens again, you're going to the hospital, whether you like it or not. Richard held up his hands in surrender. Understood. David watched the exchange in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally, he pushed off the desk. I need to talk to you, he said, looking directly at Elena. She frowned. About what? He didn't answer immediately, just gestured for her to follow him. She glanced at Richard, who simply smirked. Go on, he said. He looks like he might actually say something important. Elena sighed but followed David out into the hallway. He led her toward the garden, where the morning sun cast long shadows over the stone path. When they reached a quiet spot near the fountain, he turned to face her. There's something you should know, he said, his voice lower now, more serious. Eleanor crossed her arms. That sounds ominous. David exhaled. It's about Lisa. Eleanor's brows furrowed. What about her? David hesitated for a fraction of a second, then said, She's been digging into your past. Elena stiffened. Excuse me? She's looking for something she can use against you, David said. I don't know what she's hoping to find, but I know Lisa. She doesn't like losing, and right now she sees you as a threat. Elena's mind raced. She had nothing to hide, nothing that Lisa could possibly twist into a weapon, but the fact that she was even trying made something cold settle in her stomach. David watched her carefully. I can handle Lisa, but I need you to be aware. She doesn't play fair. Eleanor took a steady breath. I don't scare easily, Kingston. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. I never said you did. But beneath the teasing, there was something else in his gaze, something almost protective. And for the first time, Elena wondered just how far Lisa was willing to go. Elena squared her shoulders, refusing to let Lisa's games get under her skin. Let her dig, she said evenly. She won't find anything. David studied her for a long moment before nodding. I figured you'd say that. Elena tilted her head. And yet you still felt the need to warn me. His lips pressed together slightly, and for a brief second, the usual confidence in his eyes flickered. Because Lisa doesn't just look for dirt, she creates it if necessary. Eleanor exhaled sharply. Great. So I'm dealing with someone who not only holds grudges, but also enjoys rewriting reality. David's smirk was humorless. That's one way to put it. Elena glanced away, her thoughts spinning. She wasn't worried about herself. Lisa could dig all she wanted, and she wouldn't find anything Elena was ashamed of. But she also knew how easily facts could be twisted, how powerful people had a way of manipulating narratives to fit their own agendas. Lisa wasn't just trying to hurt her. She was trying to make sure David saw her as a liability. The realization settled heavily in her chest, but she pushed it aside. I'll handle it, she said finally. David's gaze darkened. You don't have to. I can make this go away. Eleanor shook her head. I don't need you to fight my battles, Kingston. His jaw tensed, and for a brief second she saw something flash across his face, something dangerously close to concern. Before he could say anything else, Maria appeared at the doorway, looking slightly hesitant. David, she said gently, your father is asking for you. David sighed, glancing back toward the house before nodding. I'll be right there. Maria gave a small nod before turning to Eleanor. And you, dear, should be careful. Eleanor's brows lifted slightly. You think Lisa's a problem too? Maria hesitated before saying, I've seen many people come and go from this house, but very few have the ability to make David look twice. You do, and that makes you a problem for people who want to control him. Elena wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she simply nodded. Maria gave her a knowing look before disappearing back inside. David turned back to her. You sure you don't need backup? Eleanor smirked. I've been dealing with entitled, manipulative people for years, Kingston. Lisa's just another name on the list. David let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. You really don't scare easily, do you? She held his gaze. No. His smirk softened slightly, something unreadable flickering in his eyes before he stepped back. Then I guess I'll see you soon, Vasquez. She nodded but didn't move as he walked back inside. And as she stood there alone in the garden, she knew one thing for certain. Lisa Monroe wasn't just playing games. She was preparing for war. Eleanor didn't have time for Lisa's games. Between her shifts at the hospital and checking in on Richard, she barely had a moment to think, let alone worry about whatever schemes Lisa was plotting. But deep down, A part of her knew this wasn't something she could ignore forever. It started subtly, a few odd glances from her co-workers, whispers that cut off the moment she entered the room. At first, she brushed it off. Hospitals thrived on gossip, and she had no interest in playing into it. But then came the questions. "So, how long have you been seeing David Kingston?" one of the nurses asked casually while they restocked supplies. Elena paused, glancing up from the clipboard in her hands. "Excuse me?" The nurse smirked. "Come on, don't be shy. It's all over the place. Miami's most eligible billionaire caught whining and dining a certain nurse. That's not exactly a small story." Elena's stomach twisted, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. "David and I are not a thing," she said firmly. "Whatever you've heard, don't believe it." The nurse raised an eyebrow. "Right, and I suppose the gala, the private dinner, and the frequent visits to his estate are all just coincidences?" Elena clenched her jaw, realizing just how easily things had spiraled. She finished stacking the last of the supplies and turned away, pushing through the swinging doors into the hallway. Jolie was waiting for her outside, arms crossed. "Okay, what the hell is going on?" Elena exhaled, rubbing her temples. "Apparently people think I'm dating David Kingston." Jolie let out a low whistle. "Well, that explains why half the hospital is suddenly acting like you won the lottery." Elena groaned. "This is exactly why I didn't want to be involved with him. The second people think there's something going on, it becomes a damn spectacle." Jolie studied her for a moment before saying, "And is there something going on?" Elena shot her a glare. "Don't start." Jolie grinned but didn't push further. "Okay, fine. But if you want this to die down, you might want to talk to the source." Eleanor sighed. She knew what that meant. She needed to talk to David. It didn't take long to track him down. That evening, after finishing her shift, she drove to the Kingston estate, barely waiting for security to wave her through before making her way inside. Maria greeted her at the entrance with a knowing smile, but she didn't stop Elena from heading straight for David's office. She didn't knock. She just pushed the door open and stepped inside. David looked up from his desk, his brow lifting slightly at her entrance. He was leaning back in his chair, sleeves rolled up, whiskey glass in hand. "Well, this is a surprise," he mused. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Eleanor shut the door behind her, crossing her arms. "Lisa." David sighed, setting his glass down. What did she do now? Eleanor took a step forward. "She's spreading rumors. And I don't mean the casual gossip kind. She's making sure people believe that I'm some gold-digging nurse who's sleeping her way into your world." David's expression darkened instantly. She continued, "I don't care what people think of me, but I do care about my job. And if this keeps up, it's going to affect my work." David leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. "I'll take care of it." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "How?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "Lisa still has connections, but she won't be able to keep this going for long once I shut her out." Eleanor didn't like the way he said it, as if handling Lisa was just another business deal to negotiate. "This isn't just about stopping her," she said, voice firm. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." David studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Agreed." Eleanor exhaled, feeling some of the tension ease from her shoulders. But before she could say anything else, David tilted his head slightly. "You know, Vasquez, for someone who insists she doesn't care what people think, you sure did come here in a hurry." She scoffed. "Don't flatter yourself, Kingston. I just don't like people messing with my life." He smirked. "Noted." But something about the way he looked at her told her this conversation wasn't over. David pushed back from his desk, standing in one smooth motion. He was composed, but Eleanor could sense the controlled irritation beneath his calm exterior. He moved toward the bar cart in the corner of the office, pouring himself another drink before glancing back at her. "Lisa's always been strategic," he said. She doesn't waste time on petty rumors unless she thinks she has something to gain. Elena crossed her arms. And what exactly does she gain from this? David swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his gaze sharp. Control. Leverage. She wants to make you uncomfortable enough to back away before I do it myself. Eleanor exhaled sharply, shaking her head. That's ridiculous. She thinks some fake scandal is going to make me run? David smirked, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. Most people would. Eleanor scoffed. Well, I'm not most people. His smirk deepened slightly. I'm aware. A flicker of something passed between them, something Eleanor didn't want to acknowledge. She forced herself to stay focused. So what's the plan? David took a slow sip of his drink before answering. I'll talk to Lisa, but I doubt she'll listen. She only stops when she loses interest or realizes she can't win. Elena's jaw tightened. And how exactly do we make her realize that? David set his glass down, his eyes locked onto hers. We prove that her narrative is useless. Elena frowned. Meaning? He leaned slightly closer, his voice measured. Lisa is counting on speculation to do the work for her. Right now she's creating a picture where you're chasing after me, where I'll eventually grow bored and move on, making you look like nothing more than a temporary distraction. Elena's irritation flared. That's disgusting. David nodded. It is. But if we shift the narrative, if we take control of the conversation before she does, then she has nothing left to manipulate. Elena narrowed her eyes. And how do you suggest we do that? A slow, deliberate smirk formed on his lips. We give them something real to talk about. She stared at him, her pulse kicking up slightly. David, if you're about to suggest what I think you are, a public appearance, he interrupted smoothly, one that leaves no room for doubt. Eleanor shook her head. You think walking around like some power couple is going to stop Lisa? David chuckled. Oh, it'll do more than that. It'll make her realize she's lost before she even has the chance to fight. Eleanor opened her mouth to argue but hesitated. The idea was insane, completely out of the realm of anything she wanted to be involved in. But she couldn't deny the logic. If they controlled the narrative, Lisa's version of events would lose credibility. Still, the thought of pretending to be anything with David Kingston made her uneasy. She let out a slow breath. Fine, but this is damage control. Nothing else. David placed a hand over his chest in mock offense. You wound me, Vasquez. She rolled her eyes. Just tell me when and where. His smirk didn't fade. The Kingston Foundation charity auction, this weekend. Eleanor stiffened. An auction? David nodded. Lisa will be there. So will half of Miami's elite. If we make an appearance, it'll send the message that she has no power over the situation. Eleanor exhaled. Great. Another night of overpriced champagne and insufferable rich people. David's smirk deepened. Careful, Vasquez. If you keep showing up at events with me, people might start to think you actually enjoy it. She shot him a glare. Don't push your luck, Kingston. He chuckled, but there was something else behind his gaze now, something curious, calculating, interested. As Elena turned to leave, she told herself that this was just another obstacle to handle, just another problem to solve. But as she walked out of David Kingston's office, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that she had just agreed to something far more dangerous than a simple public appearance. Elena had no idea what she had signed up for until the moment she stepped into the Kingston Foundation charity auction. The venue was breathtaking. A glass-ceiling ballroom overlooking the ocean, chandeliers dripping in crystal, and tables set with white linens, golden cutlery, and floral centerpieces that probably cost more than her monthly rent. She adjusted the emerald dress Anna had helped her pick out, the same shade as the one she had worn to the gala. If she was going to walk into this charade with David Kingston, she might as well do it on her own terms. David was already waiting near the entrance, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tux, his presence commanding even in a room full of Miami's elite. The moment his eyes landed on her, something flickered in his expression. Approval, curiosity, something she couldn't quite place. "Elena," he greeted smoothly, offering his arm. "You clean up well, as always." She rolled her eyes but slipped her hand into the crook of his arm. "Let's just get this over with." David chuckled, leading her into the ballroom as heads immediately turned. The murmur of conversation shifted, eyes following them with a mixture of curiosity and speculation. They had everyone's attention. "That's the Vasquez girl, right?" someone whispered. "Why is Kingston bringing her here?" another murmured. Lisa was already there, standing near the VIP section, her expression unreadable, but her perfectly manicured fingers tightening around her champagne flute. She was good, too good at masking emotions, but Elena knew a rattled woman when she saw one. David, ever the strategist, led her toward the main table where Miami's most influential guests were seated, including corporate moguls, philanthropists, and politicians. He greeted them effortlessly, his voice smooth, his presence commanding. Elena, on the other hand, felt like she was walking into enemy territory without armor. "Ladies and gentlemen," David said, his voice carrying just enough weight to capture the room's attention. "Some of you may already know Elena Vasquez, but for those who don't, I'd like to formally introduce her as someone very important to me." The air shifted. Lisa's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and the whispers intensified. Elena kept her expression calm, but inside, her thoughts raced. David hadn't mentioned how far he was planning to take this act. Before she could react, the auctioneer took the stage, drawing attention away from them. David leaned down slightly, his breath warm against her ear. Now she knows she's lost. Elena exhaled slowly, gripping her champagne glass a little tighter. This might have been David's game, but for the first time, she wasn't sure who was playing who. Eleanor kept her posture poised, refusing to show even an ounce of discomfort, despite the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on her. She wasn't new to judgment. Working in a hospital, she had seen the silent skepticism in the eyes of doctors who doubted her, in the way wealthy patients assumed she was just another nameless nurse. But this was different. This wasn't just curiosity, this was territory, and she had just trespassed. David remained perfectly composed beside her, a portrait of confidence and control. If he noticed the way people were murmuring, analyzing, he didn't show it. His fingers rested lightly against the small of her back, a gesture that was both casual and possessive. "Enjoying the attention?" he murmured, his voice laced with amusement. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her expression neutral. "I'm enjoying the free champagne," David chuckled under his breath. "Good, because you're about to enjoy the spotlight a little more." Before she could question him, the auctioneer's voice rang through the ballroom, signaling the start of the night's bidding. Priceless artwork, luxury vacations, rare wines. Each item was introduced with grandeur, and each sale reinforced the exclusivity of this world. Then, just as Elena was beginning to think she could fade into the background, the auctioneer's next words froze her in place. "And now, for one of our most anticipated donations of the evening, a private dinner with David Kingston himself." The crowd reacted immediately. Excitement rippled through the guests, women exchanging knowing glances, men raising their glasses in amusement. David didn't flinch, but Elena saw the subtle shift in his expression, the faintest trace of annoyance. She leaned closer. "This wasn't planned?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Lisa." Eleanor understood instantly. Lisa was forcing him into a bidding war, a power play in front of the entire room. The auctioneer continued, his voice light and engaging. A rare opportunity to dine with one of Miami's most influential businessmen. Bidding starts at $10,000. Immediately, a hand shot up from the VIP section. 20. Elena turned slightly, her eyes landing on a woman draped in a silk gown, her expression confident. Lisa. David let out a slow breath. Of course. 30. Another voice called, this time from a younger socialite toward the back of the room. 50. Lisa counted smoothly, her lips curling into a slight smile. Eleanor had never been a part of something so absurd in her life. Women literally fighting over a dinner with David as if he were a commodity, an asset to be acquired. But she understood the real game. This wasn't about dinner. This was about control. David remained silent, letting it unfold, but Eleanor could feel the tension radiating from him. Lisa lifted her glass, her voice light, mocking. "Oh, come now, ladies, surely someone can offer more than that." The room laughed, but Elena could hear the challenge underneath it. 75, another bidder called. Lisa didn't hesitate. 100. The audience gasped, murmurs rippling through the ballroom. David finally spoke, his voice smooth but sharp. "Lisa, if you wanted to have dinner with me, you could have just asked." The room erupted into laughter, but Lisa's eyes darkened slightly. Then, before Elena could even process what she was about to do, she raised her hand. Silence. David's head snapped toward her, his eyes unreadable. Lisa arched a brow. "Oh? This is unexpected." Elena took a steady breath, keeping her expression calm. 150. The crowd reacted instantly, shocked murmurs, amused glances. David Kingston's mystery woman had just outbid Lisa Monroe. Lisa's fingers tightened around her champagne flute, but she recovered quickly, offering a slow, measured smile. "Well, well, how interesting." The auctioneer hesitated before clearing his throat. 150 going once, twice, sold. Applause erupted. Elena exhaled slowly, finally turning to David. He was watching her, his expression impossible to decipher. "Care to explain what just happened?" he asked, his voice quieter, sharper. Elena lifted her glass to her lips. "I thought I'd save you from a terrible dinner companion." David chuckled, but it was low, dark. "I see. And what exactly does that make you?" Elena smirked, holding his gaze. "Someone who just paid a ridiculous amount of money to prove a point." David studied her for a long moment, then shook his head slightly, amusement flickering behind his eyes. "Well played, Vasquez." Lisa, standing across the room, set down her glass with just a little too much force. She had just lost in front of everyone, and she wasn't going to forget it. The moment the auction ended, Elena felt the weight of every curious gaze in the room. The whispers had already begun, speculation weaving its way through the crowd like wildfire. Who was she really? Was this some elaborate game between her and David? Was she just another woman caught in his orbit? David remained composed, unfazed as he took her arm and guided her toward the exit. "Congratulations, Vasquez," he murmured under his breath, his voice carrying that infuriating hint of amusement. "You just made yourself the center of attention." Elena shot him a sideways glance, her grip tightening slightly around her clutch. That was the point, wasn't it? He chuckled, his grip on her lower back light but firm as they moved through the throng of guests still watching them. "I just didn't expect you to play the game better than Lisa." Elena smirked, but before she could reply, a voice stopped them in their tracks. Quite the performance. Lisa stood near the bar, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes burned with something sharper. She swirled the champagne in her glass lazily before taking a slow sip. "Tell me, Elena, was that your way of marking territory?" Elena smiled, feigning indifference. "I just didn't think it was fair for you to keep bidding when you had no intention of winning." Lisa's lips twitched, but the amusement didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, darling, you really think this is about a dinner?" David's hand on Elena's back tensed slightly, but Elena was already stepping forward. "I think this is about you realizing you're not in control anymore," she said smoothly. "And now that everyone else has realized it too, I'd say that makes things pretty uncomfortable for you." A muscle in Lisa's jaw flexed. It was barely noticeable, but Elena caught it. Then Lisa exhaled lightly, setting her glass down on the bar with a soft clink. "Enjoy your victory," she said, her voice deceptively pleasant. "Just don't get too comfortable." She turned on her heel, walking away with the same effortless grace, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. David let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "I don't know whether to be impressed or terrified." Elena arched a brow. "Of what? Lisa?" David smirked. "Number of you." Elena rolled her eyes. "I didn't do that for you, Kingston. I did it because she was trying to use me as leverage, and I refused to be anyone's pawn." David's gaze lingered on her, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "Noted." Before Elena could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced down, her stomach tightening slightly when she saw the name flashing on the screen. Anna. She stepped aside, pressing the phone to her ear. "Hey, what's up?" Anna's voice was tight, uneasy. "Elena, we have a problem." Elena immediately straightened. "What kind of problem?" Anna hesitated. "It's Lucas. I think he's lying to me." Eleanor's pulse ticked up. "What happened?" Anna sighed, frustration bleeding into her voice. "I went to his restaurant after work and he wasn't there. His manager said he left hours ago, but when I called him, he said he was still working." Eleanor's grip on her phone tightened. Something wasn't right. David watched her carefully, his expression shifting. "Everything okay?" Eleanor exhaled, her mind already racing. "I don't know yet." But deep down, she had a sinking feeling that Lisa wasn't the only threat they had to worry about. Eleanor's mind worked fast, piecing together what Anna had just told her. Lucas had been acting strange for weeks, and now, with Lisa already proving she was willing to play dirty, the timing felt too convenient. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said firmly, before hanging up. David raised an eyebrow. "Lucas?" Elena nodded, already moving toward the exit. "Anna thinks he's lying to her. I need to see what's going on." David followed her, without hesitation. "I'll drive." Elena shot him a look. "You don't have to get involved in this." He smirked. "You just publicly spent $150,000 on me, Vasquez. That kind of investment comes with perks, like a personal driver." She exhaled sharply, knowing arguing was pointless. They climbed into David's car, and within minutes, they were weaving through Miami's nighttime traffic, the city glowing in gold and blue around them. Anna was waiting outside her apartment when they pulled up. She looked tense, her arms crossed, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "He finally called back," she said the moment Elena stepped out. "Said he was on his way home, but he sounded off." David leaned against the car, hands in his pockets. "You think he's cheating?" Anna hesitated. "I don't know, maybe, but I also think it's something else." Elena frowned. "Like what?" Anna's expression darkened. "I did some digging. Lucas has been making large withdrawals from his personal account, amounts that don't match anything he should be spending on the restaurant. And guess what? A few of them were made at a private club downtown." David's smirk disappeared instantly. "Which club?" Anna pulled out her phone and showed him the name. David's jaw ticked. "That's not a club," he said flatly. "That's a high-stakes poker den, and not the kind you want to owe money to." Elena's stomach dropped. Anna swallowed hard. "So you're saying Lucas is gambling?" David's eyes darkened. "I'm saying if he owes the wrong people, it's going to be a bigger problem than cheating." The words settled heavily between them. Elena turned to Anna. "You need to talk to him. Directly. No sugarcoating." Anna nodded, but there was doubt in her eyes. David exhaled, glancing at Elena. "I know someone who can find out exactly how much trouble he's in." Elena hesitated before nodding. "Do it." David pulled out his phone, stepping aside as he made the call. Elena turned back to Anna, squeezing her arm gently. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The tension in the air was undeniable as Elena sat across from Anna in her apartment, waiting. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, each one stretching the silence between them. Lucas had promised to come over and explain everything, but neither woman truly believed it would be that simple. Eleanor had seen too many people make excuses, too many lies dressed as apologies. And with what David had uncovered about the gambling den, she knew this wasn't just about a broken relationship. This was about something far more dangerous. A knock at the door broke the silence. Anna inhaled sharply, steeling herself before standing. Elena followed close behind, ready for whatever came next. Anna opened the door, and there he was, Lucas, looking exhausted, disheveled, and guilty as hell. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair slightly out of place, but it was his eyes that gave him away. There was no arrogance in them, no easy charm, just a man who had been caught in something far bigger than himself. "Anna," he started, voice low, cautious. She folded her arms. "Save it. Just tell me the truth." Lucas hesitated, glancing at Elena before shifting uncomfortably. "I didn't cheat," he said finally. "I know that's what you think, but that's not what's been happening." Anna's expression didn't soften. "Then tell me why you've been lying." Lucas ran a hand over his face, exhaling. "Because I was trying to fix something before it got out of control." He looked up at her, raw honesty in his gaze. "I owe money, a lot of it." Anna's breath hitched, but she didn't speak. Lucas continued, his voice tightening. "I made some bad bets. It was supposed to be nothing, just a few hands, a way to win extra cash. But the stakes got higher, and I kept thinking I could turn it around. Then I lost, and I kept losing." Eleanor's stomach twisted. She had seen this before. Desperation, the sinking quicksand of debt. Anna's voice was barely above a whisper. "How much?" Lucas swallowed hard. $200,000. Silence. Anna stepped back, as if the number had physically struck her. Elena spoke first. "Who do you owe?" Lucas hesitated. "I don't know their names, but they're connected to the kind of people you don't say no to." Elena glanced at Anna, who still looked too stunned to speak. Then she turned to Lucas. "Have they threatened you?" Lucas nodded slowly. "Not directly, but I got the message loud and clear." Eleanor exhaled. "And what exactly was your plan?" Lucas's gaze flickered with shame. "I was trying to get the money. I thought if I played just a few more rounds—" Anna let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "You were going to gamble your way out of debt." Lucas didn't answer. Before anyone could say another word, a second knock sounded at the door. Elena's pulse spiked. Something in her gut told her this wasn't good. Anna hesitated before reaching for the handle, but before she could, David's voice cut through the tension. "Don't open it." They all turned as David stepped into the apartment, his usual composure razor sharp. His gaze flickered to Lucas, then to Elena. "You're not expecting anyone else, are you?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Elena shook her head, already moving closer to the door. "Who is it?" A beat of silence. Then a voice, low and unfamiliar. "Lucas, we need to talk." Lucas went pale. Lucas stiffened, his eyes darting toward the door as if debating whether to run or face whatever was waiting for him. David stepped forward, placing himself slightly between the door and Elena. His posture remained casual, but there was nothing relaxed about his stance. "You're not opening that," David said flatly. Lucas swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "If I don't, they'll just come back." Elena's pulse hammered in her ears. This wasn't just bad. This was dangerous. David glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable before turning back to Lucas. "You made this mess, but you're not going to fix it by getting yourself killed. You let me handle it." Lucas hesitated, but when the knock came again, harder this time, he nodded. David pulled out his phone and sent a single text. A few seconds later, his jaw relaxed slightly. "Security's coming. Stall." Lucas took a shaky breath before stepping toward the door and unlocking it. As soon as he cracked it open, a man pushed his way inside. Tall, dark suit, cold, calculating eyes. He wasn't alone. Another man, broader, lingered in the hallway. Elena could tell immediately. These weren't the kind of people you reasoned with. "Lucas," the man said smoothly, barely acknowledging anyone else in the room. "You've been hard to reach." Lucas forced a weak smile. "I was just getting the money together." The man arched an eyebrow. "That's funny, because from where I'm standing it looks like you're stalling." His gaze flickered toward David, who remained calm, his hands in his pockets, then to Elena and Anna. His smirk widened slightly. "Didn't realize we were having a party." David finally spoke. "Lucas is under my protection." The room shifted. The air tightened. The man's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "That's so." He looked David up and down as if reassessing him. "Didn't peg you as someone who plays hero, Kingston." David's smirk was slow, deliberate. "I don't, but I do clean up messes." For a moment it was a silent battle of dominance. Then the man exhaled, his amusement returning. "That's good to know. I assume then that you'll be taking care of the debt." David didn't blink. "I assume you'll accept the full amount and walk away." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Your money's good, Kingston, but that's not how this works. Lucas made a deal with us. That means we decide how it ends." Eleanor tensed. This wasn't just about money. They wanted control. A message. David took a step forward, his voice smooth but edged with something sharper. "Let me make something clear. If you want to turn this into a war, you won't like the outcome. So take the deal, take the money, and disappear before you make the kind of enemy you can't afford." The man considered him, his expression shifting slightly, as if realizing David wasn't bluffing. Then he sighed. "Fine, I'll be in touch with the details." With that, he turned and walked out, his partner following. The door clicked shut, leaving a thick silence in their wake. Lucas let out a shaky breath, looking like he might collapse. "Holy," David cut him off. "Pack your things. You're leaving Miami tonight." Lucas blinked. "What?" David's expression hardened. "You just put a target on yourself and the people around you. I'm buying you time, but if you're still here in 24 hours, I won't be able to stop what happens next." Lucas's face drained of color, but he nodded. Anna looked at him, something raw in her expression. "Is this really what it comes down to?" Lucas swallowed hard, guilt flashing in his eyes. "I never wanted this." Anna exhaled, then finally, after a long moment, nodded. "Then go." David turned to Elena. "You okay?" Elena met his gaze, her pulse still high, but she nodded. Yeah. David studied her for a moment before exhaling. Let's get out of here. Elena didn't argue. As they stepped outside, the cool night air hitting her skin, she turned to David. You didn't have to do that. David smirked. Yes, I did. She studied him, something shifting between them, something real. For the first time, Elena realized she wasn't just walking away from chaos. She was walking towards something she couldn't ignore anymore.